Welcome to Let's Be Perfectly Queer, a queer podcast creating space to talk about all things queer. My name is Archie, and I'm joined by a very special guest, Frank New.
Questions of how you identify, seeking answers to clarify. Whether you're queen
or somewhere in between, let's be perfectly queer.
How you doing?
Hello, great, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for wanting to jump on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a while. We've been trying to link this up since, I think when we first started. You were one of our first followers, which was really exciting. And we've been trying to link it up since then.
Oh, yes.
On today's episode, we have here Frank New, a queer, non-binary, multi-hyphenate artist and fashion researcher based in New York. Frank also holds a Master of Arts in Costume Studies from New York University. Today, he joins us to talk about the queer story of Barbie, being on the second edition cover of Queer Style, and if we have time, we're also going to touch on the current PhD research Frank is conducting. Welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
So glad. Firstly, would you like to quickly introduce yourself, your pronouns, and where you would like to start with today's episode?
Sure. So pronouns, I am flexible when it comes to that. So I kind of float, and that's kind of where I prefer to be in that regard. So more about less constriction and just being open to whatever it is in the moment. And I think, we can dive into talking about the queer story of Barbie and a little bit of queer doll history, which is where my initial research lies, particularly within my master's research work.
Very cool.
And so, yes. So within my master's research work that I did, essentially the angles that I sort of went after. So when I talk about the queer story of Barbie, I am looking at the queer designers that have collaborated for Barbie over the years. So looking at Billy Boy, looking at Bob Mackie, Jeremy Scott, the Blondes, and sort of telling the story behind the box is really like what I'm looking at. You see this doll in the box, but that's kind of like all you get. So my research kind of digs deeper and goes behind the box and talks about the relationship that Barbie has to each of these designers. And for most of them, like how Barbie has served as a muse, not just in the particular collaborations, but sort of long before the collaborations came about, and how like Barbie has been a rather important part in their own sort of design process leading up to their own careers. And so it goes into that. And then I look at queer doll history, looking back to Gay Bob, which is the first known gay doll that was released back in 1977. And then there's sort of another queer doll of that sort of nature again into the early 90s. And I talk about the queer dolls that Billy Boy created as well post Mattel, and looking at the, quote, gay Ken, end quote, that Mattel released back in 1993, which was sort of an accident, if you will. And I talk about a lot of the pop culture sort of fashion, queer fashion references in regards to that. And so to sort of paint a picture. So it's the first time that you're seeing this like sculpted blonde hair. First time you're seeing Ken with an earring. And Ken is wearing a lilac mesh crop top and a lilac pleather jacket vest as well. And a particular round chrome necklace around his neck that appears to be referencing a particular adult object. And, so it was a complete fiasco, if you will. And the doll was sort of banned from the shelves after a certain amount of weeks, but it's sort of known to be the best-selling Ken doll in the history of the brand, sort of off the record, if you will, and a big part of this was sort of gay men going out and buying this doll and sort of for the first time seeing sort of themselves in such a commercial product for the first time,
That's, very cool.
Yeah, and so my research goes into sort of the background of that whole story. And during that time, it's really in the early 90s is when a lot of queer culture started to infiltrate into mainstream. So yeah, there are a lot of reasons why.
Is it true that with the gay Ken, because I remember seeing something about this, that some of the designers for Barbie were sent out onto the streets to find kind of looks and that kind of thing, and they stumbled across gay men and they thought that's a really great look? Or is that something that TikTok has completely lied to me about?
At that point in time, I don't think that would be sort of the process. But I mean, when you look at everything that I've looked at, that's not really sort of the direction that I have found within my research. But considering what he's wearing, who knows? Mattel really never went into sort of detail. The whole point of this particular Ken doll, so there was a survey that was sent out to roughly like 6-year-old girls, and Mattel was sort of trying to figure out Ken's relevance and, if they should continue with this doll. And the overarching theme of the surveys was, we like Ken, but he needs to be cooler. So this was their take on sort of making Ken cool. But, when you look at this point in time and you look at runways, you look at Gautier, you look at International Male Magazine or catalog, and you see all of these things. So there are a lot of places where they could have sort of taken this inspiration from, not realizing that that look was coming up from like the street and looking at, sort of the trickle up effect of fashion and, sort of maybe seeing this on like a version of this on a runway or in something commercial, not realizing where that came from. Because if you didn't do your homework, you wouldn't know that look trickled up from the clubs and what queer kids were wearing sort of at the time.
So queer kids were cool back in the 70s and nobody knew.
Yeah. And this particular adult accessory was known to be a very big accessory during this time in the early 90s. Like 90s queer club kids were wearing this on backpacks. They were wearing them around their neck, on bracelets, and things like that. So when you see this necklace on the doll, you can't help but sort of see this. It's like silver and chrome and attached to a thread. So, whereas one denies it, kind of hard to deny. But I look at that and sort of the commercialism of that compared back to club fashion, specifically queer club fashion in the early 90s, and referencing that in regards to sort of the Ken doll. So that history kind of goes on, and then talking about like the Billy doll of the sort of mid-90s that came out, which was labeled as the first out and proud gay doll, which is actually on their packaging, but that is not correct. And so I talk a bit about that and how the OG was Gay Bob, who was sort of a cross between Robert Redford, sort of looking anatomically correct as well. But then the Billy doll sort of takes it to the next level. If you're not familiar with the Billy doll, I highly recommend Googling, but it was very over-exaggerated in every shape and form. Very much of that sort of gym type of the 90s, if you will. Very much in that stereotype. And so looking at that, and Thomas Finland doll, which sort of came after that, and another sort of very Billy doll-like in terms of exaggerated features. So looking at that sort of history of gay dolls, and then going into the last piece, which is looking at Creatable World, which was the first gender-neutral doll line created by Mattel back in 2017.
That's so cool. I didn't even know about that.
Yes. It came shortly thereafter when Mattel first did the changes with Barbie, with the changing the body types. It came about a year or so after that.
That's so cool. I'm sure as well for young kids, it's nice to see themselves more in dolls.
Yes, exactly. I thought the Creatable World line was really great. They have like interchangeable wigs that you can kind of switch out and less defined features of Barbie, so makes it a little bit like shorter in shape. And yeah, I thought they were really great. And the fashion packs with them were really good.
That's so cool.
Yeah, so that's kind of a gist of my master's work and sort of what I focused on, looking at Barbie from a queer lens and sort of showing that story, which has never really sort of been captured in that detailed of research work. I feel that there are sort of bits and parts of kind of what I focused on here and there, but never such a body of work altogether in one piece.
That's very cool, because the only one I knew about was the one with the mesh and the attachment around their neck. I didn't know that there were more queer identities through Barbie, so that's really cool. Do you reckon that is also like a bit of Mattel, but also maybe some of the designers trying to have their own influence with the dolls?
Oh, absolutely. Looking at the designers that have designed for Mattel, specifically the queer designers, you definitely are getting a piece of that person's vision for sure. Like when you look at the Bob Mackie dolls that are like opulent and over the top, you can look at a Bob Mackie Barbie and know that that's a Bob Mackie Barbie. And the same with like Billy Boy in the late 80s. And the two dolls that he designed are quintessential Billy Boy when looking at the styling and the fashion, very much. And then, you look at the Blondes collaboration, and there were even things going around that Mattel created the first like drag queen Barbie, which wasn't really the case, but that's sort of what it was being dubbed as, the first drag queen Barbie, because of the design, which is very much, again, quintessential the Blondes, which is over the top and very detailed, and it's a beautiful doll.
That's very cool. I have to look up all these Barbies when we finish so I can have a look at it and see the different journey and the different designers and try to guess which one's which, because that's so cool.
Yeah, and Billy Boy was the very first designer that has his name featured on the
That's
packaging. Cool. And I think it was really great that it wasn't just a designer, it was a queer designer, and they're getting their name on the packaging.
Yeah, because you really don't see people get recognition for it.
Yes, exactly. And then with Jeremy Scott, so there was a set that he designed for Moschino, which was a Ken doll and Barbie set of one of the series of dolls that he released, and it was a look from a VMA red carpet look of his and another person. And with that particular doll, it was the first time that you're seeing Ken in designer clothing.
Because, yeah, he's usually kind of like the sidekick. I remember when I grew up, it was always like the beach clothing or like the not as nice or not as glam as Barbie.
Yes, exactly. He's always known as being Barbie's greatest accessory.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the gist of my research on queer Barbie and sort of the angles that I look at.
That's very cool. Is there anywhere that we can read your research or access your research about Barbie?
Yes. So if you go to my Instagram or my website, frankienew.com, I do have my work on there. And if you just message me either through Instagram or send me an email specifically, I have them password protected. For anyone that wants to see it, feel free to reach out to me and I can give you that information.
Can I just ask, with Barbie, before we move on to the next topic, for you, was it fashion first or Barbie first? What love came first?
I would say it's probably more Barbie. I definitely was a Barbie fan as a kid, but I was not allowed to play with Barbie. I had sort of the classic toxic masculine ideals of a father that was completely out of the picture. So like many queer people that I've chatted with, I played with Barbie in secret with a friend down the street. And so that's kind of where my interest in Barbie sort of came from, and then kind of left that behind and then came back to it as an adult.
Was it a bit freeing coming back to it as an adult?
Absolutely, because I sort of set free those sort of notions in my head that, I was told that boys don't do this, boys don't play with dolls, playing with dolls will make you gay, and reaching that point as an adult where like none of this holds weight is very freeing in itself. And just getting to the point where it's like, if I want to play with dolls or collect dolls, I will do that. And if someone doesn't like it, I don't really care.
Exactly. So you have a collection of the dolls?
I do.
Oh, is it a lot?
It's a lot. Probably somewhere around 500.
500? That's crazy. Do you have them all on display?
I did. I gave up my apartment a little over a year ago and became a nomad.
Oh, that's cool.
So everything's in storage, but it's all archived and recorded. But yeah, I do miss kind of seeing them out and about.
See, and now Katie can't give me a lot of crap for all my pop vinyls because I don't have anywhere near 500 pop vinyls.
Those are great too.
It's fun to collect. I feel like collecting, and especially toys and little figurines and stuff, it helps you hold on to that childlike innocence or that inner child inside, and it just brings me like this joy. Do you find the same thing? Just like this childlike joy and wonder?
Oh yes, absolutely. definitely, and sort of nostalgic to, when I see like certain designs that just remind me of childhood, and yeah, it's a lovely feeling.
And Barbie and fashion, is there touches of that in your art?
For sure. I mean, I've worked in fashion for the last 20 years, so it's very all intertwined.
That's very cool. Was there anything else you wanted to chat about Barbie before we move on to the very exciting cover? I saw the cover. It looks great.
Thank you. No, I think that, there's a lot more for sure, like, looking at the history, that I go into within my thesis. So for, anyone that wants to, go further into the details of that and the collaborations, I would definitely recommend checking out my thesis. But I feel like it's one of those things that we could probably talk about for hours.
And then this thing will kick me off because we get halfway through talking and then it'll finish. So this is the second edition of Queer Style.
Yeah.
How did you get on the cover?
So it happened by really all about the timing of it all. So the author, or one of the authors, is my PhD supervisor, Vicky Carminas, who's based in New Zealand as well. And Adam, second author, is based in Sydney. And so the week that it happened, I'm not sure exactly the backstory, but whatever was going on with who they were trying to get for the cover wasn't working out. And I sent my bio to Vicky, one of the authors, and that photo is in my bio. And it was sort of a thing where I was supposed to send this to her like weeks before, and I just forgot. And so I remembered and sent it in that moment. And, what I didn't know what was happening with the book cover at that time, and they were facing a deadline of getting this done. And so I sent her the bio and immediately received a message basically saying that this has to be the cover of the book. Like, do you mind? And, to me, like in my head, I'm like, do I mind? Like,
You're like, put me on a cover.
On a book that's going to be published and released internationally. Like, do I mind? Not at all.
And you look absolutely fabulous. So of course you don't mind.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's interesting because the photo, so I wasn't, so that's the thing is I wasn't even photographed for the book. The photo came from a shoot that I did previously, like earlier in the year. But when I saw the mock-ups of the book, it definitely made sense. Like I could see what she saw, because I feel like when you see the book, it looks like I was photographed for the book, but indeed I was not. It's actually a very special photo because that particular photo shoot, so a good friend of mine runs a vintage shop in Brooklyn, New York, and her aesthetic is very sort of Dynasty meets Fran Fine, The Nanny.
That's so cool.
Yes, that sort of aesthetic. And her line is very open. Like she's not about labels. It's all about like wear what feels good to you, sort of vibes.
I love that.
Yes, she's very welcoming in that regard, which I think is one of the reasons why we were sort of drawn to each other initially and became really good friends. And so things like for someone just putting on a dress, like she doesn't even think twice about that. So when we did the shoot, this was the first time that I had ever sort of worn a dress as just myself. And so she didn't even really know that because it doesn't even cross her mind in that sort of way. She's just like, oh, we have this great dress and you're here. So let's photograph this dress. And little did she know, that was sort of going on.
So this image, it's not just an image. It's kind of like a moment in time for you captured and on a cover.
Yes, exactly. And it really was a sort of turning point for me because I, probably a year or so before that, I had gone through a divorce and had been sort of going on a gender journey after that, and sort of finding myself in new ways that I sort of never imagined. And I started to identify more as queer and stopped really using the word gay. Queer felt more fitting. But even that, and even at the time of the photo shoot, that I was still sort of going through sort of ideas in my head, and that particular photo shoot and that moment was the turning point for me that ultimately led me to realize that I identify best as non-binary. And just really, for me, it's just less constriction is really what I like and what I found to be the most like freeing for me. is being in a space where I can just float and be whatever it is in the moment. And because sort of in my head and in regards to like wearing a dress was something that I always associated with. If I wear a dress, I have to be in like full drag. I could never wear a dress as just like myself. When in reality, you can do whatever you want.
It's very true. And I don't think that fashion or clothes should have a gender label. If you feel great in it and you look great in it, just put it on.
Exactly. And that's really what I had to go through, like in that journey of like realizing that that's exactly how I look at it. And, there's some days, I may want to wear a dress and Doc Martens, and then the next day, like giving like leather daddy sort of vibes and having that freedom to do that, being in a space where I feel the most free that I've ever felt in my life to just be whatever it is in that moment.
That's awesome. And I love that that's been captured for you and on a queer book. Can you tell me a bit more about it? What's inside?
So it's the second edition of Queer Style, and it really goes into a lot of how queer people use fashion as a way to identify. And the second edition goes further into sort of trans identities and queer style and things like that. And that's really one of the biggest updates with the second edition. And, and so like in that regard, it's something that I very much identify with, which was it was such an honor to be on this cover. Because that, for me, like fashion is truly a way that I identify, like with many queer people. It is sort of an armor, if you will, and very much how I identify. And I use fashion to identify as a queer person.
On that cover, you just look so free. And to know that, you've come from a background where you had quite a traditional father in sense, or a masculine toxic father, and how far you've come and how free, and you just look so comfortable, and you like you've lived like that forever. It's absolutely beautiful. I really, knowing now that what you've gone through, it's just, you just look free and elegant and like you've been wearing that dress your whole life.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, when I sort of after the fact, when I had that conversation with the stylist, she was so like moved by that, because she had no idea like what was going on in my head, at that time of like, this is, like it just really truly opened my eyes that like, oh yeah, I can do this. I can wear a dress. I don't have to be in drag to wear a dress. Like if I want to wear a dress, I'll wear a dress. And yeah, it sort of helped clear up sort of the things that were going through my head of like my identity and moved me towards sort of the non-binary sort of way of identifying and realizing that that's where I really fit, and that like less about labels and just more about just being whatever it is in the moment. And the same with like dressing too. Like I don't look at gender. Like when I look at clothes, to me, if I like how it fits and I love the garment, like that to me is the most important. I just always find that interesting, like of how much emphasis people tend to put on clothing. Because I will be asked from time to time, like, oh, is that men's or women's? And I generally reply with like, oh, I don't know.
That's the best response. So keep them guessing because it doesn't really matter at all.
Exactly. And that's generally how I respond when I get asked.
It's the perfect response because, they want you to respond with a gender. And when you don't, they just don't know what to do. And it's perfect.
Exactly. I love making people uncomfortable.
Because I know you don't have a lot of time, but did you want to quickly touch on your current PhD research and what you're doing there?
Sure. So the topic for my PhD research stems from the very end of my master's thesis. So I did a coda instead of a traditional conclusion, and I interviewed another queer fashion doll collector as sort of another way of saying, like, I'm not the only one. Here's another perspective from a collector. And so when I did that interview, I initially really just did it as like an interesting way to end this piece of research. And then after I did that interview, I found it much more interesting than I thought. And so it never really left me. And then when the idea came to explore a PhD topic, I went back to that and started to figure out like how to turn that into a much bigger project, and that's sort of what I was able to do. So essentially my PhD focus will be interviewing queer fashion doll collectors, somewhere between 20 to 25, essentially, and looking at two parts, looking at the childhood story of a collector and looking at how many experience sort of very toxic masculine ideals, sort of being denied to play with dolls because playing with dolls will make you gay. And sort of that notion and, having to play with dolls in secret and, which can be, very traumatic experiences as a kid because I don't know about you, but like, as a kid, like you don't understand these things when an adult is like telling you, like, you can't play with this, and it's these insecurities and backgrounds that they experienced. But as a kid, you're like, it's a toy. Why can't I just play with a toy? So
yeah, I can totally relate to that. Being a kid, I wasn't allowed to play with the boys' toys. I wasn't allowed to play with the action men. I wanted the action men, the action figures. I got given a Barbie, and you're going to hate this, but I cut all the hair off to make it look like a boy. I was just like, I don't understand why I'm not allowed to play with the toys that I want. It's just a toy.
Yes, exactly. And it's so unfortunate that many have to go through that as a kid because you truly don't understand. You're like, it's just a toy. And it's, the parents and their thought process. So looking at that story and those experiences as a collector, and then sort of for most, like, leaving Barbie behind. And so looking at that piece of the story and then looking at returning to dolls or similar objects as an adult and realizing and looking at that moment of where one goes, like, if I want to do this, if I want to play with dolls, I will surely play with dolls. Like, I don't care. And you sort of squash those ideals that, are cemented in your brain as a child that you in some ways subconsciously, like, just have this thing in the back of your head of like, oh, I can't do that. That's wrong. And then realizing and then squashing that idea. And so looking at that and then how they collect and what they collect, and if they do any kind of sort of art form, here in the US with like Trixie Mattel is a great example of someone queer collector, but also uses their passion for fashion dolls through drag, which is really cool. And yeah, so looking at that and all through the queer lens of queer theory, masculinities, and gender.
I also think sometimes that it's really hard when you grow up presenting as male and you have to fit in this kind of masculine box, and that anything you do seems to be less masculine. It's almost like a harshness, where with me, when I was growing up, it wasn't that, it was just like, we don't do that, we play with this. But I feel like it's really unfair for queer presenting males because they have this kind of toxic thing from society that kind of pushes them down and they have to really hide who they are. Do you resonate with that at all?
Oh yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, growing up, my father was in the Vietnam War. I feel that paints a very specific sort of ideal. And so that's, as a kid growing up, like, I was always told constantly that I was different from very early on. And I didn't feel different, but I figured I had to be different because I was constantly told that, but I had no idea what that really was. And so I have never been able to hide my queerness, even from a very early on age. And so it was obvious. And like, my father was in denial and sort of painted this whole picture of a life that, was truly not me at all. So I was set up for failure from the get-go of, sort of this idea that like, I have to carry on the family name and, maybe you should enlist and, go into the army and, do, all these things that like, no, like that's not me at all.
Your world would have been completely different had you gone down that path.
Yes, exactly. And, but when I look at that now, it's like clearly denial. Like, you're, this person, is creating this life in their head of like, trying to move away from the fact that like, no, I'm queer, like, individual, and like, those are not things that I'm going to do. But it's just interesting, like, experiencing that sort of as a kid. And I know that many queer people go through sort of similar things of sort of these ideals that are kind of drilled into our heads that are not what any of us want. And, it takes time to sort of get to that point as an adult or, whenever, age where we're able to just kind of live the life that we want and we're meant for.
Yeah. And did you need some more queer doll collectors? So if anybody is listening right now and they are a queer collector, is there any way they can get in touch with you or reach you to be a part of your PhD?
Yes, I'm definitely open to taking more respondents. You can find me on Instagram at manyourstyle or my website, frankienew.com, and send me a message.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Before we leave, I've got two things. One, what is your last word of advice to our listeners? And then two, if you could create your own Barbie, what would it be like?
So I feel a good word of advice to go out on is be unapologetic, be loud, and be you, especially in a time, definitely here in the US, be as loud as you can be and be heard. That is just so important right now in this day and age with everything that's going on in the world. And as far as a Barbie, I feel that if I would have my own Barbie, it would truly be head to toe in leopard print.
Love that.
With a pop of red.
That's very cool.
Leopard is like my favorite neutral. For me, it goes with everything.
I've never heard someone say leopard is a neutral.
I mean, yeah, it's like...
Oh, love that.
Welcome to my world of fashion.
Oh, well, I think that's where we're going to end this episode on leopard is a neutral, told directly from a fashion designer. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode and reaching out. I think it was early last year when we first started. So thank you so much for sticking around. And I've been looking forward to this chat for a very long time. If anybody wants to get in touch with you, where can they reach you?
You can find me on Instagram at manyourstyle, all one word, and frankienew.com.
Amazing. Thank you everyone for listening. If you like this episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your favorite platforms. And until next time, I hope that we have been
perfectly queer.
Let's be perfectly queer.